Scream 6 was released on March 10th this year and arrived digitally just a few days ago. It was directed and written by Radio Silence, a collective of filmmakers that have also produced a number of shorts, Ready or Not, and Scream 5. They took over the franchise that seemed gone forever after Wes Craven passed in 2015, and it seems they have larger plans for the Scream franchise beyond this entry. Overall, the film is decent. It's well shot and has good performances, including a remarkable improvement from Melissa Barrera, and has solid tension and scares. Unfortunately, the film is let down by its writing, the case for a number of Scream sequels. It's overly expository, with little effective humor, and the final act that feels straight from a Scream ripoff in the early 2000s. It's certainly an entertaining watch, however, and though it's 2 hours long, it moves at a good pace, and the highlights are well worth the price of admission. It's just unfortunate the problems are so glaring. Spoilers from now on, and if you would, please like and subscribe. Scream 6's biggest problem is that it doesn't commit to anything. This is especially true with character deaths, but also with meta-commentary and even the general premise. Early on, they have a character watching Jason Takes Manhattan, but this film makes the exact same mistakes with regards to the Big Apple. The film is so close to being good, even great, but none of its moments stick the landing. Radio Silence's Scream has emphasized the brutality of Ghostface. It's not just sticking knives into people, but stabbing them over and over, ripping and tearing, and a solid amount of blood. Dewey's death in the last film was a particularly brutal example of this. The aim is to make the violence feel impactful, and attract the gorehounds. However, while the moments work for the first act of the film, in the final act it all falls apart when it turns out the people that were knifed to shreds are perfectly fine, capable of moving and even running. This is of course not new to the Scream franchise, as Dewey famously survived a number of apparently lethal attacks, but even then the pain he was in wasn't emphasized nearly as much, and the wounds were less numerous. The most egregious example is Chad, who is double-teamed by a pair of ghost faces who stab him upwards of a dozen times. Then the finale happens, taking at least 15 minutes, and only then do emergency services get to him. In the same scene he's taken away, they also reveal that both Gail and Mindy both survived their attacks, bringing the notable character deaths to 0. The only non-villain character that died is Mindy's girlfriend, who had half a line of backstory. This was in part an attempt at subversion, as the oft-repeated mantra of the franchise is that no one is safe and everyone's a suspect. With that in mind, not killing characters is a surprise and offers a bit of the meta-commentary the franchise is known for, and this could work. Except there are multiple fake-out deaths, which makes it feel cheap, and more like lying to the audience than subverting expectations. It's Game of Thrones all over again. In terms of horror movie meta, this is a particularly weak entry. Mindy is the Randy of this generation, and offers a monologue about the nature of franchises, which is what they're in now. Ultimately though, it feels like a cheap knockoff of the speech in Scream 2, with many of the same rules and ideas. Scream 4 had a similar issue, where they made up rules for remakes, including that being gay was guaranteed survival, and given the bury your gays trope, that's a far cry from the truth. This is also more of a personal issue than an objective one in the film, but at one point Mindy and Kirby, who's really a wasted character in this film, have a little horror geek-off, talking about the horror franchises, but it's the most basic bitch opinions. The first Nightmare on Elm Street is the best, Psycho 2 is underrated, and they weirdly enough agree on the Candyman remake. It's lukewarm takes, and when you're trying to highlight how deep they are into horror, it feels artificial. I know the guys who made this are big fans of the genre. They include a murder party reference early on, but this feels like dialogue dumbed down for the general audience, which is disappointing. The film is set in New York, it's been on all the posters, it's the big marketing draw, but ultimately feels like it could be in any city. There are 2 scenes that feel like they're in the city, although the whole thing was filmed in Montreal. The first is a bodega where Ghostface wanders in and murders a few innocents, as well as the owner of the store in a relatively tense scene. It's not unique to New York, but managed to impart some feel of the city. The second is a scene on the subway, which has some neat lighting for a horror sequence, with seconds of total darkness, but it's also unlike any actual subways in the world, meaning if you take a step back, it just doesn't work. Otherwise there's some poor geography, as well as timeline stuff, where it takes a few hours to cross a few city blocks. Not unheard of, but when the characters have a police car with sirens, it just seems like a mistake. Overall, it's not a bad film, but the writing is really letting it down, and in terms of the Scream sequels, it's tied for 5 as the worst. I know 3 was often seen as the redheaded stepchild, but the themes it deals with, exploitation of women in the film industry, are still relevant today, and aside from the magic voice changer, it's generally pretty solid. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Scream 6, or the franchise as a whole. Thanks for watching, and be well.